Coming up in the Authorpreneur Podcast.
You know, what you're describing is, I think, an issue across the board, and it's multifaceted and it's very complicated as to why. I think it's more of an issue with fiction than it is with nonfiction. So I think the statistic is only one out of every 5 novels is purchased by a man. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of them nature, some of them nurture, and some of it is hard to kind of parse out. And I don't really even know if trying to do that is in my best interest, as far as just knowing that it's an issue and trying to do something about it.
Welcome to the Authorpreneur Podcast. I'm your host, mystery author Amelia D. Hay. On this podcast, I will bring you writing, book marketing, and self-publishing advice so that you can create your dream author business, build your author platform, and be creatively independent. You can find the episode show notes and lots more information on the podcast page at authorpreneurpodcast.com/podcast. Hello, writers. In this episode of the Authorpreneur Podcast, I chat with Douglas Vigliotti about getting into reading, its hidden benefits, and the Books for Men podcast. Just to let you know, this is the first part of a 2-part interview with Doug. In the second part, I discuss his book, Aristotle for Novelists. I felt that this chat about his podcast and reading was long enough to warrant its own episode. And to avoid clickbaiting, because this interview is 19 minutes and the second part is around 43 minutes long, I made the decision to split the episode in 2. So you get it. I erred on the side of caution and created 2 episodes. Before we get into the interview, here's a bit about Doug. Douglas Vigliotti is the author of 4 books, including Aristotle for Novelists and Tom Collins, a Slightly Crooked novel, which is available to listen to on Slightly Crooked, Good Stories Told Well, a podcast that features his raw and unorthodox poem collection, Mini Heartbreaks, or Little Poems About Life. He's also the host of Books for Men, a weekly literary podcast to inspire more men to read. So without further ado, let's get into the episode. If you've heard something in this episode that was helpful to you and you'd like to support the show, then buy me a coffee for as little as $2 at buymeacoffee.com/author AD. Welcome to the Authorpreneur Podcast, Doug. How are you going?
I'm going well. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
No problem. So, out of curiosity, how did you get into writing and publishing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my journey is, I don't want to say, I think people could find similarities in everybody's journey, but I commonly find that when I talk to a lot of writers, a lot of them are bibliophiles. A lot of them, you know, when they were younger, they always wanted to be a writer or they read a lot. And that just wasn't really my situation as a young person. I was really into sports, and I was the youngest of 5, a youngest of 3 in a family of 5, you know, parents, and I was the youngest boy. And so I always wanted to prove myself, and I got into sports at a very young age, specifically hockey. And, you know, it really defined my childhood and later into life. And then following that, I went into a business career. And then I would say somewhere around my mid-20s, I really picked up reading a lot, for lack of a better explanation. And I just really started to get into reading nonfiction, fiction, all different types of things. And shortly after, that led into writing. And I ended up, my first book that was published was actually a business book. It was a nonfiction book that went in conjunction with a business that I had at the time, helping small business owners with sales process, sales strategy, just helping them with the sales aspect of their business, because that was what my business history was in. And after I wrote that book, it was the only book that I ever wrote purely for commerce. And everything that I've written after that was because I learned that I loved writing. Okay. And that's sort of, you know, you could kind of trace the arc of my creative career by my creative output, you know, and I've been writing for now publicly for probably over 10 years between published books and my podcast, my blog. And you could really, if you look at the charting of my creative output, which started with nonfiction and then went more into fiction and poetry and then craft. And then, and I'm really been focused on fiction for the last, probably 5 to 6 years. And, now I'm just really starting to blossom into the things that I really, really want to do with my creative career. And I think that that's just been a long arc. And I don't know if there's any similarity out there for people, but it definitely hasn't been a straight line to get to where I'm at right now.
Yeah. I have to admit, I've noticed that my husband too, when he reads, it's purely work related because he's a software engineer, and to get there, he's like had to write a thesis. But when he's into the habit, when he reads blog posts, he might read a book, he'll read like memoirs and bibliographies of other people in the genre. It's very like niche, and I think it's because if you take your kid to a traditional school, they're sort of encouraged to go off into these particular sort of gender stereotypes. Like boys are encouraged to pursue like sports, and women are encouraged to just like stay inside and do like reading and stuff like that. And I think it's because they put the genders together and they teach them together, so they naturally sort of slot into those roles. And you can definitely see it. I worked for Orion Publishing, and in finance where I was, there was like one guy. That's not typical of the finance industry. Usually there's a mix. But when you looked at the rest of the publishing house, even Gollancz, which is sci-fi, which tends to have more male readers than sci-fi, right? Even then, it was predominantly female. And I think this is typical of the people who will apply for jobs in that sector, in the publishing sector. They are predominantly female.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, what you're describing right now is something that I'm pretty familiar with. It's one of the reasons why I started the podcast that I have. The podcast that I have is called Books for Men, and it's a weekly literary podcast to inspire more men to read. And every Monday I'll share a nonfiction or a fiction book. And that goal of that podcast is exactly that. It's to engage men to read all different types of fiction and nonfiction. So I read across the literary spectrum, predominantly crime, literary fiction, memoirs, biographies, but I sprinkle in a lot of different things. I read a lot, but what you're describing is, I think, an issue across the board, and it's multifaceted and it's very complicated as to why. I think it's more of an issue with fiction than it is with nonfiction. So I think the statistic is only one out of every 5 novels is purchased by a man. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of them nature, some of them nurture, and some of it is hard to kind of parse out. And I don't really even know if trying to do that is in my best interest, as far as just knowing that it's an issue and trying to do something about it in the small way that I can, say with the podcast, is what I'm attempting to do. And for people who say, I'm not really sure about this whole men don't read as much thing.
Yeah.
Well, I challenge you to go around a group of guys and ask them what they're reading, because I can tell you from being a guy and growing up as a guy, it's very few and far between when there is a man who's actually reading something. And if they are, it's mostly nonfiction. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think you could just do a back of the napkin test around a group of people, and you can see that. But if you look at the big data, as you would point to, whether it's workers inside of the publishing industry, whether it's, now this wasn't always the case, by the way, for a long time, it was very heavily male dominated, and actually publishing is one of the only creative industries. I would lump them in with film, with music, where it's predominantly female now. That isn't the case in any of those other creative industries. And I think that there was a correction that was necessary in the industry, and it opens up the voices, and it opens up, the ability to get voices out there in a more predominant way than they were prior. Having said that, it still doesn't eradicate what is true. And what is true is that there isn't as much fiction, say, maybe angled towards men or men that are reading. And I'm always the proponent of, this is why I don't have like masculine books on my podcast. I don't believe in such a thing necessarily, because it's like, you're going to pick up whatever you are interested in, whatever engages you. So if the wider of a net that I cast and the more variety that I'm able to share, then that may interest somebody. And that to me is the bridge to get somebody into reading. And I always say, read about ponies, read about golf, read about tennis, read about romantasy. I don't care what you read. If you pick it up, it's going to build that, that consistent reading habit, and you're going to reap the benefits of that. And then it's going to bridge you to the next thing. And the reason why I'm so passionate about that is because that's how it happened for me. I kind of skipped over that. Well, I didn't skip over that. I kind of glossed over that when I was saying I picked up reading in an aggressive way in my 20s, and I picked up a book. I enjoyed it. And then it led to the next one and the next one and the next one. And before I know it, I was reading 60 to 70 books a year without even thinking, because it was just something that I was getting so enriched by. And I want that experience to happen for a lot of men out there, because I think the world would be a better place if men were reading more.
Yeah. It's kind of like a rabbit hole you get sucked in, because there was a good period of my life where I didn't read. Like, I started out like at the age of 7 writing picture books for myself. And then like I wrote my first play at 9, and I tried to hire actors like at school during lunchtime. And then I got to like as a teenager, and I just stopped reading like for my teens and 20s. And then I got into screenwriting, and that's where I learned 3-act structure. And I think that's what got me reading again, because in order to learn it, I was buying books, and then I just started accumulating books. And then I started working for Orion Publishing. And when you work in a publishing house, you get books. They have books all over the place, and they'll be like, oh, our shelves are too full of all these excess books. Go down to, this department and see if you like books. Or you get authors like Ben Aronovich. He came in, and I got his first 3 books in hardback signed because I worked there. And between screenwriting and in 2013 when I joined Orion on a temporary contract, this is really what got me into reading, is just being here. And I think at this time I sort of transitioned from screenwriting to writing novels, because I soon realized that even if I sold something, there was a good chance that it would never make it to the screen. And I think self-publishing became a big thing at that time. It was easier to do outside of the US.
Sure.
And I think this is what got me into reading.
Yeah, I always say it's interesting. I say the thing with reading, for me anyway, and the way I like to describe it, especially to non-readers, because I think readers get this pretty intuitively, is that all of the value of reading comes from the act of reading.
Yeah.
And that's why reading whatever you're interested in is so important, because people think that you're reading to learn, and you are reading to learn, but to me, that's one of the least compelling reasons to read. What are some of the more compelling reasons to read? All of the hidden value that's like associated with it, right? Whether it's being more patient, right? Because if you are, you're forced to delay gratification, especially in a fiction sense. You have to read patiently to get to the end to get that gratification. Now, to me, especially just hitting on that alone, with all of the entertainment today that gives you instant gratification, juxtaposing that and balancing out your consumption diet with a little bit of long form, delayed gratification entertainment, to me seems like a really good idea for anybody to do, because whether we realize it or not, we're sort of being hardwired by the technology and the evolution of technology, and we're evolving in a way where we have very, very little patience, and that trickles down into your interactions with people, your relationships, you name it. And so that's just one of the what I call soft skills you get from reading, but it may be more important than anything that you're actually reading. And that's why I'm such a big proponent of actually reading the book and not listening to the audiobook. I have nothing against audiobooks at all, and I understand the function of them and the form and why they're a good solution for a lot of people. But it gets into like another soft skill that I think reading builds, and that is focus. So when you're reading, there's nothing else you can possibly be doing while you're reading. That, again, is a nice balance to everything else that we have in the world that we're able to do while we're doing something else. That is the reason why audio is so big, right? Podcasts, audiobooks, because we can listen while we're washing our hands, while we're in our car. There's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't have your undivided attention. When you're reading a book, it has your undivided attention. Again, I can think of a lot of situations in life where that skill would be extremely useful, and help you, whether it's in work, whether it's in personal relationships, and so just reading itself does all of these things that I'm describing, or even reading is less, you could read difficult ideas and stories easier because the form isn't as aggressive. It isn't as reactive. So when I hear Doug Vigliotti talk on a podcast, it's a little bit more reactive than reading what he has to say, because in reading it, you're able to digest it. And even if you don't agree with it, there's the ability to, entertain it. Whereas if I say something you don't like right now, you might just say, screw this guy, and click off. But there still might be a lot of value there, right?
Yeah.
In what you're, and so reading gives you that time and space to really digest what you're reading. And so it's easier to handle tough ideas, difficult concepts, differing opinions. And I think, again, another skill that we are lacking in society right now, based on a lot of different factors that are complicated, mostly because of the way things have evolved. And I don't want to keep blabbing on about reading, but I think there's probably quite a few readers here. And these are just some of the soft skills that I think are really important in association with reading, even more so than, say, reading 14 principles on the art of story, right? Like, that's great, but there's other things that matter just by picking up that book and actually reading it.
Yeah. I have to admit, I'm probably in the audiobook camp purely because I figured out that I went from reading like 12 books a year to 50, and I can only do that with audiobooks.
Totally. I get it.
But I do get the patience thing, but I come from a big family. Like, I'm the eldest. I have 3 younger siblings, so I like a good debate, but I'm also pretty patient. And that's like being trial by fire, right? Having a lot of
100%.
siblings, you sort of pick up those skills. And I think I'm patient, but it's cultural. It's the Australian culture, so I'm quite calm. Like, I don't really get any more excited than this. Like, I'm just pretty even-keeled. But I think that's a cultural thing as well.
I think I've had to unlearn some pretty bad habits from that were hardwired into me as a young person. Being the youngest of 3 boys, I think I learned some pretty tough things that I had to kind of, and the arc that I always describe to people is that the last 5 to 10 years of my life have been unlearning as much as they've been learning. And one of those unlearning things is being patient, because in my house, it was always the loudest person gets to speak.
Or you talk over the top of each other. I'm still trying to stop doing that.
And so learning how to not walk through the world with that and be more patient. But I think reading has really helped me in that regard. I really, really do. I should say that I'm a pretty simple person, and I would say 80% of the consumption that I take in is either a book, a movie, or a documentary. And people say, well, what about TV shows? What about, and I watch TV shows, but not as much as movies, not as much as documentaries. I don't read as many articles or I read books. That's how I get my answer. So I listen to podcasts, too, in the car and whatnot. But I mean, I'm pretty, I'm not a big YouTube person. I don't have TikTok. I don't spend time with those short forms of content. And I do understand where there is a lot of value in it for a lot of people. But I just read. That's just what I do. And so I think that has helped me, especially coming from that standpoint in life, as I described before.
I think it depends which side of social media you're on, especially with TikTok. I've found a lot of like true crime documentaries and books through there, but it just depends on where you focus your time. But again, it's a time suck. If you're on this, you're taking time away from reading or writing or whatever it is that you're doing in life. Thank you for listening or watching this episode of the Authorpreneur Podcast, where I spoke with Douglas Vigliotti about reading and his podcast, Books for Men. I hope you enjoyed this episode. In the comments section below, let me know, how did you get into reading? We all have a slightly different journey, and I'm interested in hearing from you about where your love of books began. Once again, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Happy reading and writing, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Authorpreneur Podcast. If you love this episode, then hit the subscribe button and leave a review on your favourite podcasting app. I'm your host, Amelia D. Hay, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.